So I just want to come here and talk a little bit about strength. And so I just wanted to come on here and talk about strength and the relationship between the body and the brain when it comes to strength. I think a lot of people, especially when they're new to the gym, seem to think that being stronger is just about having big muscles, but there's a huge brain aspect to it as well. So I like to think of it as a spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, you have the type of exercise that is really focused on making your brain able to activate more muscle and be strong in that sense. And then on the other side is being stronger just by holding more muscle mass. So, and you know, these two things are not opposites. You can be working on one while you're working on the other. So I just want to cover today what actually is strength fundamentally, what has it got to do with the brain, what's it got to do with the body, and then how can we apply that information to our training, right? Because if we understand what is happening here within these systems, we can more understand what we're doing in the gym and then make adaptations to our training that will hopefully see us become better, become stronger, and becoming more able. So to start, I'd like to bring up an image that I've seen go viral a couple of times on the internet. Although when I bring it up, not everyone has seen it yet. Essentially, it's an MRI scan of a quadricep muscle in a couple different populations. So the first one is a 40-year-old that practices the sport of triathlete. So what we can see is a nice quadricep muscle. This is an MRI scan of the quadricep, and it's got a lot of muscle in there. Okay, that's what you expect someone who participates in a lot of sport. They have a nice, big, thick muscle. And then it shows you a picture of an MRI scan in a different person. This one is a 70-year-old sedentary person, somebody that's not very active in their life. And then last but not least is another 70-year-old person. However, they're also still practicing their sport, even in their older age, and their quadricep muscle looks a lot more like the 40-year-olds than the 70-year-olds. Simply going on the principle that if you don't use it, you lose it. And I'm pretty sure if you look pretty closely at the image, you'll notice that the 70-year-old's bone in the middle there is slightly thicker as well, because that's one of the adaptations we get from resistance training and training heavy, is we get thicker bones. So I was traveling not too long ago, and I ran into a guy in a hostel of all places, and we talked about how you train, how you stay strong even as you age. And he said, why is it that you get weaker and less muscular as you age, but you're able to maintain your cardiovascular ability? And that was very true, because the opposite is the reality. After a certain point, you do start to decline in cardiovascular ability. That's not to say you cannot improve at older ages, you certainly can, but there's definitely a downward trend there. When it comes to muscle mass, there is also diminishing product. You will diminish in strength as you age. However, holding on to muscle is a lot more easy than it is holding on to cardiovascular ability. Just like we see here, holding and maintaining muscle is something quite easy for the body to do as long as you keep using it. A mentor of mine, on her 80th birthday, I saw her do a headstand, right? That's incredible, simply because she never stopped doing it. She's always been into exercise, always been into fitness, and she's able to carry that over into her older age. So let's look at the fundamental of how a muscle works, and then we can talk a little bit about the systems to work on either the brain or the body. So you have three types of muscle fibers. So I've drawn one here. This one is your type 1 muscle fiber, and this is built for endurance, but it's not built for strength. Okay, so when I think of something like going for a long run, you're using a lot of these muscle fibers because they're built for endurance for longer period of time. Whereas if you're going more for a sprinting, then you're going to start looking at these muscle fibers up here, and these all the way up here are the type 2B fibers. Okay, so that's 2B, and they're built for strength. They are not very good at enduring. After a few seconds, they're all out of energy, but that energy they do produce is really strong. And this largely comes down to fuel sources. These type 1s, they like oxygen. There's a lot of what we call mitochondria in that cell, and it turns oxygen into energy. Whereas all the way up here, they like to use sugar, and that produces a lot of energy, a little bit faster as well, but it prevents that energy consumption coming as quick. And then there's also your type 2A fibers, also known as your adaptable fibers. They can look more like the type 1 or more like the type 2, just depending on how you train, what kind of exercise you do. If you do a lot more endurance training, they get a lot more like the endurance muscle. If you do a lot of strength training, they look a lot more like the type 2B muscle. Very interesting stuff. So how does the body know what to activate when it comes to the muscle? Should it activate the type 1 or the type 2s? So what you've got to remember is the body is essentially just electricity, okay? And it's sending all these electrical signals throughout the body that's telling it to move what muscles and when. Now what happens is you have a impulse in the brain that tells a muscle to move or to contract. That's what we call it. When the muscle gets smaller, it contracts. Now, there are what we call motor units. Essentially, all these muscle fibers, or all the fibers of a muscle, will all contract in one go, whereas another part of the muscle fiber is not going to contract at all. Every fiber is all or nothing, while the one next to it might be on the nothing, the one that's going might be on the doing. Okay, so these are called motor units. The signal the brain sends to a muscle fiber to fire is a motor unit. Okay, so if the brain is sending a signal to 2 motor units to fire, then those muscle fibers are going to fire. Those 2 muscle fibers are going to fire in their entirety, nothing else. If it sends 3, then 3 fibers will fire in their entirety. Now there's much more than 3 fibers in a muscle. There's an awful lot. But what happens is the electric signals follow the path of least resistance in a way. What that means is they're always going to activate the muscle fibers first that need less electrical stimulation. Or what we call the low threshold motor units, or in other words, the motor units that need a little amount of energy to cause that contraction, that shortening of the muscle. Whereas then, so that is going to predominantly fire your type 1 muscle fibers. Okay, they're usually going to come first, simply because they need they're innervated quicker by that low threshold motor unit. All the way on the other end of the spectrum then, to drive the type 2B muscle fibers, we need to encourage a very powerful electric signal. The high threshold motor units don't like to innervate unless they have to. Okay, so this is what the cell looks like within the body. It has, the brain signals come in, touch to one of these outside points. It sends a signal down the wire, comes to one of these outlet points, and one of these outlet points will connect to a muscle and cause that motor unit or that muscle fiber to fire. Okay, so this is an interesting aspect of fitness because it means we have to put a lot of weight and a lot of stimulation to activate these muscles, okay, these type 2B muscles. And what's interesting about the type 2B muscles is typical theory suggests that these are the ones that like to grow, these ones like to get bigger. Having said that, in some research, especially in long endurance athletes, the type 1 fibers are just as big as the type 2 fibers. There certainly is an aspect of growth of the type 1, but normally when you're doing your traditional strength work in the gym, you're working your type 2B fibers and even your type 2A fibers, trying to get them to be bigger and stronger and therefore act more like the type 2B fibers. Okay, so that's what a muscle fiber is. But then, well, let's dig a little bit deeper into muscular action, muscular contraction, and muscular stretching. Okay, so within a muscle here, I have this big muscle, there's two lines here that touch at the end, and then when a muscle gets shorter or a muscle contracts, it wraps around, okay? And then these two lines come together to meet one line in the middle, and because they're meeting in the middle, that muscle has gotten shorter, okay? That's the contraction. And then the eccentric, the stretching of the muscle is when these two pull apart. Okay, so when they come closer and when they pull apart. Now there's a few different types of muscular contraction. So I've already used the word. Concentric is the contraction, the muscle getting smaller, and there's the eccentric, when the muscle gets longer. There's also isometric, where the muscle stays in the same size. Okay, and this is a huge aspect of strength training is eccentrics, isometrics, and concentric exercise. So that is how the muscle fibers work. And I feel like I've missed something, so that's why I'm taking my time to think about it, but it's not going to my head. So let's go into the mechanisms behind increasing strength to these muscle fibers. And we're going to start with the brain aspect of increasing strength. So think of the difference in your brain's ability to create strength, the difference between somebody who's doing a very heavy power lift. You know, you see the powerlifters, they pick up a barbell and then they're really slow because they're activating every single muscle all the way up, versus a basketballer who's jumping up super high to get the dunk, okay? Now, they're both producing an awful lot of force from their legs, okay? It's gonna take a lot of force from the legs to lift up the weight. It's gonna take a lot of force from the legs to start the basketball. However, they're two very different experiences, because this is a very slow, sustained, activating every muscle fiber, whereas this is a 0 to 100, activating everything, okay? So from this here, it's clear that there's a huge aspect in the brain, what we're telling the brain to do towards training, okay? And part of it is, when I was talking about motor units, how many motor units your brain can fire at one time. Is it able to switch on most of those motor units, or is it switching them on sequentially one after the other? Another aspect is to do with electric potential, or the electricity. How much is it being lost? So this spine all the way down the cell here, that's creating that electricity that comes from the brain, goes to the muscle, right? How much of the electricity is getting lost away from the system? And that is something you can train, is having a more efficient system where less of that electricity is leaking out of the cell. And essentially, the more we do something, the more that pattern gets remembered in the brain, and the more efficient we get in that pattern. And I was going to say something else, but I forgot. So yeah, what I wanted to say was the brain has a huge capacity to get stronger, right? It can, there's tiny people out there that are weightlifting absolutely massive numbers, 2.5 times their body weight, easy peasy. And, well, maybe not easy peasy, but the brain's capacity for strength is absolutely huge, but it's also really hard to make that adaptation. This is the sort of thing we have to be trying to do to some extent every single day to let the brain know. So I'm not going to go into the methods yet, but there's something called greasing the groove, which is a popular training method, especially in the calisthenics and bodyweight training world, where throughout the day you might disperse with a couple of pull-ups or a couple of bodyweight dips, or you can use weighted exercise as long as you're not doing too much and causing yourself damage from not warming up. But by interspersing this stuff through the daily life, we're telling the brain, this exercise is important, you've got to get good at doing this, okay? Whereas that stuff is not going to be affecting the body so much. But the body has less ability to change, but I like to note that if you are a beginner in the gym, your body can actually grow a lot of muscle quite quickly, a lot of strength quite quickly. But as we get more adjusted to training, it's going to be really hard. Just for a little bit of muscle, it's going to take a lot of effort to get that aspect. And that's absolutely huge because when it comes to strength, the nerds have their big long equations, to do with angles and limb lengths and joints to express how much force the body can produce. That's all, lifting weights in the gym is, it's force. And they have these big long equations, and for the most part, most of it doesn't matter to us, right? Because they're not things that we can change. But there are two things we can change. It's the brain side and it's the body side, okay? Like I said, it's a spectrum, the brain and body. We can make the brain better at performing the exercise, or we can make the body better at performing the exercise, or usually a bit of both at the same time. I completely went on a rant, I've lost my track, so I'll move on to the next thing. So when it comes to building a bigger body and making your body stronger, there's a few ways to cause hypertrophy, the building of bigger muscles. So essentially those two aspects of strength that I said you can change, the brain's ability or the size of the muscles. Essentially what we look for is the cross-sectional area of a muscle, okay? If I were to cut my bicep in half and look how large that muscle is, the bigger the muscle, the stronger you are. Quite simple as that. But there's a few different ways we can cause hypertrophy and the expansion of the muscle. And number one is what we call mechanical tension. Okay, so I like to think of this as an elevator, a lift, right up in the lift shaft, and then it's at the top. There's a little pulley up here, and then the more people that are in that elevator, the more tension we have to get on this pulley. Okay, so as you create that tension in the muscle, from the more weight you use, that's going to tell the brain to make a hypertrophic response and increase the muscle through that heavy weight. This is the hypertrophy you see from normally very heavy lifting, which is typically more on the brain side, but there will be a hypertrophic response there. Whereas there's the bodybuilding type of hypertrophy. These are ones you see the guys doing in the gym when they're doing all their bicep curls, and that's what that's doing is creating little tears and damage in the muscle. Okay, and as that muscle tears and damages, it's then going to have to put effort into rebuilding that muscle, and in theory it rebuilds it a little bit thicker than it was before, and thereby increasing the size of that muscle. And then there's the what we call metabolic stress side of muscle building. So think of a long endurance cyclist. They cycle all day every day and they don't do a whole lot of work in the gym, but they still have these absolutely massive quads, big calves, despite not doing all that strength work in the gym, simply because of the metabolic stress, or in other words, the need for the muscle to produce lots and lots and lots of energy over a longer period of time is filling that muscle with, it's creating a lack of oxygen with that muscle, it's filling it with byproducts, it's changing the acidity of the muscle, it is changing blood pressure, it's changing hydration. All this stress that goes on in that muscle over that longer period of time tells the brain this muscle needs to be stronger, so let's make it bigger. Okay, so that's how these cyclist guys, Tour de France, have such big quads, but they're not in the gym hitting so many leg extensions, although they certainly could be and they certainly should be. So that's a little bit about how we create that building of muscle in the body. So let's say now you go to the gym and you're putting together a training program, and there's different methods that are going to be different levels of the spectrum. Are you training more the brain? Are you training more the body? Okay, because it's the brain body spectrum. So there's a few different aspects of a lift that we can see progress over a number of weeks, because that's all it is you want to see a little bit of progress every single week, every single workout, however you want to break it down. Progressive overload, you might have heard it referred to as. So one simple one, if you look over here, do a little watch, it's the time of the exercise, okay? And that could be how long it takes you to do the exercise, the tempo. So if I'm doing a bicep curl, I can do a slow rep, I can do a fast rep. So typically if we're looking to work those type 2 muscle fibers, those explosive ones, because that high threshold motor unit, we need to tell them a lot of information and put a lot of power into it. Tell them to activate, we want to go heavy weight, we want to move that weight as fast as possible, put as much intention into that weight. So you want to use quite a short repetition there. However, a method for training these type 1 muscle fibers, right, and these can grow as well, they can get hypertrophic response, is through slower reps. So this was a method popularized by a guy named Joel Jameson, where he said do 10 reps, but with a 2-second lowering and raising of the weight, or eccentric, concentric. And as you do that, you want to promote full breathing throughout, all the way in on the eccentric, all the way up on the concentric. And essentially, because these muscles use oxygen as their main fuel source, we're constantly supplying them oxygen. So we're encouraging the type 1 muscle fibers to work with this training method, these slow reps. And another aspect of it is, I talked a little bit about the concentric and the eccentric of the muscle, so getting longer eccentric, getting shorter concentric. When it comes to eccentric type training, they quite like to have slower reps. You can't just do loads of eccentrics. You can go for maybe a negative pull-up, so start the chin up above the bar, 3 seconds down, boom, just like that. Say you do that for 5 or 6 reps, and then next week you could maybe do 5 or 6 reps again, but now you're going for 4 or 5 seconds. And that stretch, because the muscle is actually stronger than it is going eccentrically than it is concentrically. So we're providing that stretch, and that is causing a lot of that muscular damage, because we're dragging out how long it takes to happen, and it's also causing quite a lot of the mechanical stress as well, because you are stronger in that eccentric movement. You're putting a lot of tension on that wire. A lot of people you see in the gym will cheat their pull-ups. They won't go all the way down to the bottom, and they won't go all the way to the top. Simply because when your muscle is at its resting length, so where I was talking about these little lines here that cross over and they get shorter, when your muscle is at rest, is where the most of these lineups stacked upon each other are meeting. And when that muscle is really stretched out at the bottom of the pull-up, there's actually less of these little guys meeting, so then it takes more effort to increase the pull. Okay. The opposite is also true at the very top of the rep. We're missing out some of those overlaps, so then we're missing out on the ability to contract that muscle, because there's less of these guys here to help you out. But that is part of the training. To get stronger, then you're going to have to build more of these bridges at those range of motion to get stronger, and building more of these bridges means that muscle is going to get bigger, and we're going to see that hypertrophy response. I think I went on a bit of a ramble there. There's also isometrics, so holding the weight in the same place, and you're also stronger in that position, but that is an aspect of a timed rep that we can see a lot of control in. Well, I've lost my train of thought. Yeah, so you can quite easily see an increase in hold times of isometric exercise. Typically, when you do an isometric or you're holding a really challenging position, you see this with a lot of the calisthenics guys doing their planches, there's an awful lot of mechanical tension there and putting a lot of stress in those wires. So you can typically only hold a maximum intensity isometric for a couple of seconds, and then as you go into elongating that time, the muscle gets stronger to adapt. So we're looking more at that endurance, that metabolic stress of holding the position, and then eventually you go on to progressing, using a harder variation of that exercise. So that's messing around with the tempo is a method of progression. And then there's reps and sets. Okay, this is one of the most simple progressions you'll see is just doing more reps the next time you work out, or more sets. Sets is a bit more of a dangerous game to play because then at what point are you doing too much? Okay, but typically to see more of the brain side of training and more of that brain side, you want to do less reps but more sets. Okay, so you can oftentimes get away with quite a lot of sets if you're only doing 3 reps. You can do 6 sets quite easily. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum here, we're typically seeing higher reps, and then 3 sets is typically ideal. 3 or 4 is good for that hypertrophy range. If you're doing higher numbers of reps, you don't want to be doing too many sets because then you're just overly fatiguing that muscle, and then there's a long way to go with recovery. I haven't even started talking about recovery yet, but that's coming up. So another aspect of training is rest times. So what you could do is decrease the rest time after each set of an exercise. So this is essentially doing more work in a shorter period of time, also known as density training. Now, I'm not a big fan of changing this one, simply because how the body restores energy is always within, think of it like a set amount of time, okay? So within 30 seconds, your body is not yet fully restored, whereas within 60 seconds, there's a little bit more, but it's still not fully restored. 3 minutes, we're almost there, but we're still not fully restored. It's up till we get 5 minutes of rest, then we're at 100%, okay? So there's a level of it's exponential, there's a diminishing return. So there's a huge jump between no rest to 30 seconds rest, still quite a large jump between 30 seconds rest to 60 seconds, but then significantly small between 60 seconds and 120 seconds, and a smaller jump again. So if we're looking for maximum strength building, which like I said is more on this brain side, we're looking for a good few minutes of rest between sets. Whereas if we're looking more on this body side, it's less important because we're trying to look for, maybe it's more of that metabolic stress, or maybe it's more of that muscle damage, and you can get away with much lesser rest. Up to, if you're really working on the endurance of your fibers, 30 seconds of rest, whereas the hypertrophy response of muscle damage, 60 seconds to about 90 seconds normally works quite well. But because these rest periods work quite well for these specific things, I don't think it's such a good method to change it as a means of progression. However, there are people who do that, and there are people that have had good success with it. And last but not least, the creme de la creme is increasing the weight, okay? And every time you do an exercise, say you're doing overhead press, next week do a little bit heavier, okay? With an overhead press, there's not so much heavy you could go every week, but that's the idea. So when it comes to a simple progression, we are simply just changing one of these 5 aspects here. Now, there are more complicated series of progression, and that goes into various types of what we call periodization, or, you know, in this month we're going to work on this particular aspect, maybe say it's more on the brain side, and then next month we'll work on this particular aspect, maybe sort of more on the body side. And then, but for the most part, especially if you're quite new to the gym, just pick one of these and then watch that increase over a number of weeks.